Welcome to Dabdown, Anecdotes of the village of Whitecroft in the Forest of Dean. So why is the village called Dabdown by the locals? There are many thoughts as to how it gained this nickname. Firstly, what does the word dab mean? It is widely believed to be a Welsh colloquial word to mean to wander, a term lost in time. So why is the tiny hamlet of Whitecroft any different to other forest villages? Well, the most widely published answer refers to the fact that from the late 19th century until the early 1960s, up to 1,300 people a day used to dab to the village to work, shop and even play. Following on from that, there is the story that on a Sunday afternoon between visits to the chapel, Dabdowners, as Whitecroft folk were called, would congregate on the bay in their finery and then walk up and down Park End Road for their constitutional, chatting and even singing. It was called a dab parade, an event inherited from the Welsh who had come to the village in the 19th century to work down the pits. There would be groups of girls and groups of boys eyeing each other as they passed, deciding who they would ask out during the week. Nothing improper occurred, of course. Perhaps that was because their parents would also be dabbing up and down the road, keeping their eyes on the young uns. Over the years, the youth of the village continued to congregate on the bay, and in 2009 the parish council erected a shelter with seating for them. However, I have never seen any teenagers meet there. The only young that ever use it are the offspring of the commonest sheep. Who are the Whitecroft Greeks? This is another peculiarity of the village of Whitecroft. The term Greeks refers to their sporting teams and was also once used to refer to the male voice choir. The earliest recorded mention was in the Gloucester Citizen in October 1922, when a report about a rugby match referred to the village team as the Whitecroft Greeks. Trying to find out the origins of this nickname has not been easy, and I'm still none the wiser. Some say it is to do with the rugby club's badge as seen on the right. It portrays a burning torch, as does the later football club badge seen on the left. One immediately thinks of an Olympic torch when seeing this image, but it is more likely that the torch represented the early forms of lighting miners used when down the pits. Another explanation was given to me by Mario, a Greek Cypriot, the former landlord of the Miners' Arms. He thought the term stemmed from the Greek navy antics during the First Balkan Wars in 1912-13. A great victory was achieved by the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Lemnos. The Greek navy, described as the underdogs, had prevented the Turks from breaking through a blockade in the Dardanelles, and the British newspapers were full of reports about the daring Greeks. At a rugby match shortly after, at which Whitecroft was not expected to win, a spectator waved his rolled-up newspaper from the sidelines, shouting, "Come on, you Greeks!" The nickname has stuck ever since. The Whitecroft and District Male Voice Choir were also nicknamed the Greeks. They were set up in 1928, and most members were local miners. During World War II, those that were not serving the country continued to provide entertainment and were often heard on the radio. They also boasted the local poet, F.W. Harvey, as an occasional member. At this point, I will add a little story about the dais that the choir are standing on in this image. It was erected for an event at Ruradine, possibly the carnival, and shortly after this photo was taken, just as the choir were finishing their performance, the whole structure collapsed under the weight of the performers. Luckily, no one was hurt. Every year the choir held an annual dinner. At one such event in 1932, the programme featured a poem written by F.W. Harvey entitled The Greeks. It was obviously describing both the rugby team and the choir. An impromptu ode to Whitecroft Choir, January 1932. The curious thing about the Greeks, they always sing before they speaks, and drinks before they sing. And when they win a challenge cup, they straightways go to fillin' up and do peculiar things. The locals. The village has had quite a few characters live there over the last 2 centuries, but I shall just mention a few. Alfred Harris was a collier born on the Row, Whitecroft in 1839. Unusually for the time, he kept a diary in which he wrote not only what was happening in the village, such as births, deaths and weddings, but also what was happening in the rest of Britain and the world. He was a very well-informed man for someone with little education. He also kept a note of his shopping and its costs, such as bread for 6pence, cheese at 2 shillings 1.5 pence, and fish at 3pence. The lists also show that Alfred liked his beer, costing 1 shilling and 6pence, 11pence and a shilling. I have discovered in local newspapers that Alfred was often up before the magistrates for drunkenness. There are many stories involving the mill. There is the tragic story of Hubert Morse the miller, who was found dead, entangled in the mill machinery in 1912. However, I want to talk about his son, Hubert Roylance Morse. He was a bright lad by all accounts. He won a place to Bell's Grammar School, Colford, and then gained a place at St Thomas Rich Grammar School in Gloucester. He had a desire to become a doctor, and so started towards that goal after leaving school. However, for some unknown reason, he quit his studies and joined the Metropolitan Police Force. It would appear he had a gift for languages, being fluent in Serbo-Croat, Flemish, Chinese, Mandarin and Polish, just to mention a few. This aptitude earned him a worldwide reputation, especially during World War II. He became an official translator for Special Branch, and when he died in 1953, the newspapers called him the man of many languages. One could say he was the original Inspector Morse. Many locals left the village at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century for foreign climes. The grocer Roland Griffiths emigrated to Canada, as did the collier Alfred Hook. Alfred's son, Alfred Jr., became a teacher in Canada and then went into politics, where he rose to the post of Minister of Economic Affairs for Alberta. In the mid-1940s, Alfred Jr. returned to Whitecroft, where he was treated like royalty. A lavish reception was held, which included entertainment from the male voice choir and addresses from F.W. Harvey and other local notaries. The village had never seen anything like it, and has never since. Unfortunately, Mr. Hook and family were taken ill immediately after the event, and Whitecroft was blamed. Suspicions of food poisoning. But Mr. Hook wrote to the village and assured them he held them no ill will. Charlie the Shoeblack, real name Edwin Ferris, was from Exeter, but was a frequent visitor to the forest, and especially Whitecroft, where he shined shoes. He was obviously well-spoken and well-educated, but seemed to enjoy sleeping in barns and other outbuildings, and nobody objected. He also enjoyed entertaining people in the local pubs of an evening, and any tips he received he usually gave to local charities. Apparently in 1941 he lost his shoeshine box, and thereby his livelihood. A young evacuee wrote to Cherry Blossom, the shoe polish manufacturer, explaining Charlie's plight, and Cherry Blossom immediately sent Charlie a new box full of polishes and brushes. Charlie often slept in outbuildings belonging to the Aldriches in Whitecroft, and one day in 1946 he was found in one of them, very unwell, but when the police tried to take him to the infirmary at Westby-on-Severn, he refused to go. However, he collapsed eventually, and so was taken to the former workhouse, where unfortunately he passed away. The people of Whitecroft and the Forest and members of Whitecroft Male Voice Choir clubbed together to ensure Charlie had a proper funeral. Many hundreds of people attended the funeral and watched Charlie's interment in Park End Cemetery, exactly in the spot where he had often sat and dozed. In commemoration, F.W. Harvey wrote a poem about Charlie's life, and it was published in the local newspaper. Some years later, a tin of coins was found behind a loose brick at Turnout Farm in the village by Jeff Aldrich. They were thought to have been Charlie's savings. Jeff had them made into the Lord Mayor of Whitecroft's chain of office. The last person I should talk about is Chas Phipps, the former landlord of the Royal Oak Public House. Over the years he gained the nickname the Seven King, for in the 1960s to 80s he was a record-breaking water skier. He was in fact the first man to water ski the Seven Bore. He set many endurance records as well, having skied 100 and 330 miles non-stop along the Severn Estuary and River Severn, and in 1969 he water skied on Lake Windermere, up and down for 473 miles non-stop over a period of 15 hours. Whew. Even at the age of 77 he was contemplating skiing the Seven Bore again, but ill health prevented this achievement. In his youth he'd been a musician with a band called the Moon Rockets, and later a group called Chas Time Band. He went on to own nightclubs in Spain and England, and after he took over the licence of the Royal Oak, the village often rocked to live bands. Fun and games in Whitecroft. It has often been remarked that Whitecroft was the wittiest village in the Forest. In 1935, as part of the annual carnival, the first Lord Mayor of Whitecroft was elected, a local named Eddie Ruck. This was purely a ceremonial position. The aim was to provide entertainment and add gravitas to fundraising activities. At the same time, other roles were elected, including that of a Prime Minister, hangman, bishop and jester. The office still exists, but has not been used for many years. A set of bylaws were introduced that all Dabdowners had to comply to for fear of prosecution. Found guilty of any misdemeanour, and the Special Lord Mayor's Court would impose a fine or community service, all for the benefit of a local charity. Jeff Aldrich was once found guilty of damaging a stepladder after he had fallen off it. His penance was to provide tools and labour to help level the recreation ground. When Merv Morse was elected sheriff in 1973, he was immediately sent to jail by the newly elected Lord Mayor Jeff Aldrich for failing to buy the first round in the pub. Jeff Aldrich provided the jail, his cowshed. I mentioned earlier Charlie Shoeblack's savings, which were found in Turnout Farm. Jeff Aldrich had them silver-plated at the pin factory, and then they were sewn onto a black velvet collar, which became the insignia of the Lord Mayor from the 1950s on. It looks today as good as it did when it was made. Over the last 100 years or so, the village has had much sporting success. In rugby, many cups were won by the Greeks between the wars, and after, especially the Forest of Dean Combination Cup, which they won on 17 occasions. The team played their home matches on the pin factory site, and then bathed afterwards in the Miners' Arms. A former player, Gwyn Hill, remembered that 3 baths were set up in the Skittle Alley, and he would run backwards and forwards, filling them up with warm water. The players would bathe in turn, but usually the last 3 would come out of the baths almost as dirty as when they went in, because of all the mud that had washed off their teammates. The team unfortunately folded in 1958, shortly before it was due to move to a new home, the recreation ground on Grove Road. However, the recreation ground did not go to waste, for it became the home to Whitecroft Football Club, which had been officially launched in the Miners' Arms in 1952. The teams originally played on a field, now occupied by a housing estate known as Whitecroft Gardens. It was a very boggy field with no facilities, and in fact the goalie, Howard Jones, often played in his mac and wellies. The team also used the Miners' Arms to change and wash, but in 1959 they moved to the recreation ground, where they later built themselves a clubhouse with all necessary fitments, including a bar. In 1956 the team had joined the Gloucester League and immediately won the League Cup. In 2020 there are 4 football teams in Whitecroft, still winning cups. It would appear in the 1960s there was a women's team, possibly sponsored by the Pin Factory, who often played against the men in charity matches. Cricket was also played in the village as early as the 1920s on a field just behind the Miners' Arms. The wicket was regularly mowed short, but the outfield was kept down by the cows. More often than not, a fielder would fall into a cowpat when trying to stop a ball. In the 1940s the team won many caps and accolades. They even won the Viscount Bledisloe Cup outright after 3 wins in a row. Unfortunately, the team folded shortly after the Second World War, but in 1977 the club was reformed, and to begin with used kit and equipment loaned to them by the Pin Factory, who had sponsored the original village teams. The new team this time played on a proper ground belonging to the Forestry Commission on the Park End Whitecroft border. This club unfortunately folded in 1981. I have found evidence that there was once a women's cricket team in the village. In 1939 they appeared in a Gloucester Journal, having beaten a team from Pillerwell. Unfortunately, the reporter mentioned the leading batswoman was a Mr. Humphreys. I hope this was just a typo and that Whitecroft weren't cheating. Whitecroft at work. As people moved into the village in the early 19th century, so shops began to open and the village became a place of trade. In 1841, a Benjamin Hutchins was trading as draper and grocer, and gradually over the next 100 years his shop was joined by more, including 2 butchers, a bonnet maker, boot and shoe repairer, post office, bike shop, co-op, wool shop and fish shop. And by the 1960s there were 16 shops, including 3 to 4 sweet shops. The children were well provided for. There was no doctor or dentist though. In 2020 there's just a fish and chip shop, a part-time bric-a-brac emporium and a travelling post office that comes all the way from Bromyard, Worcestershire, for an hour on a Wednesday morning. Not many people dab to Whitecroft anymore. Lots of hard-working colliers, chemical workers and quarrymen meant that premises that sold liquid refreshment opened in abundance in Whitecroft from the early 1800s onwards. The village was originally covered in orchards, so cider was the principal drink, with 2 cider presses still operating in the 1960s. The Miners' Arms was the first public house to open. Leases for the land go back as far as 1826 and show the inclusion of an orchard on the bay, so cider was probably made on the premises. By 1861 the census shows that a brewer, Henry Bodenham, was living at the pub, so we can presume that the pub also brewed its own beer. The Miners was a public house, so could sell spirits as well as beer, but in the village there were many beer houses, some operating from people's front rooms with names like the Victoria and Crown and Anchor. In the 1861 census there is a strange anomaly that shows there are 2 Miners' Arms. It would appear that the Beach family, who lived in a collier's cottage on the Row, were selling beer from their front room and had called themselves the Miners. In 1870 Tom Beach was fined £20 for selling beer without a licence, a huge amount of money and probably a fine he could not afford. Sadly it would appear that within a few months both he and his wife are recorded in Alfred Harris's diary as deceased. There were other properly licensed drinking establishments in the village though. There was the Bell at the bottom of Wesley Road that had its own cider press. Today it is better known as Vimpany's Cottage. On Park Hill the Royal Oak grew out of a farm, and on Pillerwell Road the New Inn operated until the mid-1960s. The closure of the Princess Royal Colliery in 1964 and the decline of the pin factory saw drink sales decline, and so by 1970 there were only 2 pubs left in the village, and at the time of giving this presentation there is just the Miners' Arms left. A sorry tale for a once busy, thriving community. In 1824 there were 2 corn mills in the village. Kidnall's mill was situated to the east of the village on the Rudge Brook and didn't last long. Whitecroft mill was built on the River Lyd, on the former site of an iron forge owned by Sir John Wintour and worked for King Charles I. The mill stopped working in the early 20th century, but the building still remains and has been occupied by the same family for over 100 years. Apparently the workings are still inside, though a lot of work would be required to get it working again. The village was originally pasture land and orchards with a few farms. One farm, Turnout Farm, is still worked, though its original farmhouse and outbuildings are rather derelict and house cattle, not people. So why is the farm called Turnout? The farm is situated next door to the Miners' Arms, and back in the 19th century, when everyone was thrown out of the pub at closing time, they used to swagger down to the farm and continue their drinking with some home brew. Hence Turnout Farm. Simples. Just south of the village there are a few remains of 2 chemical works that used to operate and pollute the area. There was Morgan's Chemical Works, which started in the 1870s but was closed by 1883, and then nearby in the late 1890s the Tufts Chemical Works opened and remained there until after World War II. Both enterprises produced naphtha and its byproduct tar, and it is said that doctors would recommend that those suffering from whooping cough or other chest complaints visit the sites and inhale the fumes produced as a treatment. There have always been rich seams of coal under Whitecroft. It was once the home to many gales, such as Grove Engine, Pillowell, Random Shot and Beaufort Engine. When Turnout Farm was put up for auction in 1907, Beaufort Engine Gale underneath was included in the sale. Most of these small gales were eventually amalgamated into the Princess Royal Colliery, which operated from the mid-1800s until 1962. At the height of its operation, the colliery employed over 1,000 people, who would dab each day to the village. The seam stretched almost to Cinderford in the east of the forest, and there is the story of a collier who moaned that he had to dab over a mile to work each day, and then back another mile to reach the seam which was almost under his home. Out of the coal industry other businesses emerged. Brickworks were one such enterprise, which used the clay dug out of the pits to produce fire bricks and tiles. Whitecroft bricks were stamped PRC, representing the Princess Royal Colliery, from where the clay was collected. Looking at census records, it would appear that a great many of the employees in the 19th century were women. Slag heaps marred the village landscape for many years, but some entrepreneurs did try to make use of the waste materials. The Patent Fuel Company in 1865 manufactured coal briquettes for domestic use from Whitecroft slag. They took waste coal, crushed it, and then forced it under steam to produce a brick of coal. Unfortunately, it was not a huge success, which seems a shame, as it was an early form of recycling. The factory only lasted a few years, the slag heaps longer. Luckily today the heaps have been recycled into beautiful mounds of trees and homes for wildlife. For a short period in 1882, the Patent Fuel Building was used by the Pyramid Electric Company, who lit up Whitecroft with artificial lights. That didn't last long, and so Whitecroft was reduced to oil lamps and candles until the 1930s. In 1910, the Patent Fuel Factory building was bought by the Jarrett family of Birmingham, who opened the Whitecroft Pin Factory. In the beginning there were 6 women making everything by hand, though gradually machines were introduced, and by 1934 30,000 gross of safety pins were produced a week. Surprisingly, most were exported all over the world, because here in Britain it would appear we were using German-made pins. However, that all changed when Nazi anti-Semitic activities started in the late 1930s. After World War II, the company had several owners and rebrandings: Whitecroft Scoville, Prim Fashions, and then Whitecroft Essentials. It moved into producing electrical goods and aerosols, but still maintained producing its core products for haberdashery and stationery outlets, which it still produces today, though they are made overseas. In 2017, the factory moved to Micheldean, ending over 100 years in Whitecroft. A little anecdote about the company that is in the 1960s and 70s they employed a lot of outworkers. These outworkers were women kept at home by their families, who would collect a bag of pins and cards on a Monday and return on a Friday with the pins attached to the cards ready to be dispatched. They did this to earn pin money. Just before World War II, 3 men, Donald Nash, Royston Morgan and a Mr Hook, set up a motor engineering garage on Park End Road called Nash and Morgan. After the war, the business expanded and Mr Hook was replaced by Mr Elsmore, and the company diversified into coach building. Take a chassis to them and they build the body to your specifications. In the mid-1960s they branched into building caravans, mainly for travelling and fairground folk, who paid for their vans in cash, literally. A former employee, John, recalled being called into the office on many occasions to help count bags of half-crowns taken as payment, quite often totalling £2,000 to £3,000. The caravans were usually very luxurious, with etched mirrors, wood panelling, and sometimes pull-out kitchens. The most famous caravan they built was for Jerry Cottle, circus owner, in 1976. It was 55 feet long, 8 feet wide, and cost the princely sum of £20,000. Each member of the Cottle family had their own bedroom, and it boasted crystal chandeliers, central heating and running water. In fact, the caravan was so large that it gained an entry in the Guinness Book of Records. It caused Jerry quite a headache, taking it home to the West Country. He had to obtain a special licence to manoeuvre it through the narrow streets of Chepstow. In his autobiography, Confessions of a Showman, Jerry describes how nerve-wracking it was to tow such a large vehicle, and that in Chepstow they had to go the wrong way up a one-way street because it was too long to get round corners. There was worse to come once he took it on the road. The family were often bombarded with abuse because of its slowness and length, and so in the end Jerry decided it had to go. I wrote to Jerry to see if he remembered what he did with it. Apparently he sold it to another circus owner in 1979, and the last he heard of it was that in 1990 it had ended up as a residential home at Flamingo Land, North Yorkshire. For me personally, the most famous factory that was sited in Whitecroft, on the site where my home is now, was that of J. Allen Rubber, which was opened in 1952. They produced the famous marigold gloves. The Illustrated News described them as a housewife's dream. It extolled their suedette lining, which helped protect the lady's skin and nails, and their sure grip ensured one wouldn't drop delicate china or glass. And men could use them too, as they were invaluable for cleaning the car or pottering in the garden. They cost 3 shillings and 9pence a pair, not cheap in the 1950s. In 1960 the company was purchased by the London Rubber Company. It continued for a short time to make gloves in Whitecroft, but also expanded its range to include balloons. The other winter I had to call out a breakdown company because my car wouldn't start. The mechanic joked about the old factory that had once graced my estate, and asked me if I knew they used to make weekend balloons. I, of course, had no idea what he meant. The factory closed in 1983, and in 2020 the gloves are made in Malaysia, where the rubber came from in the first place. Whitecroft at war. Whitecroft lost 6 young men in the Great War, and the Memorial Hall on Park End Road was built in their honour. A plaque bearing their names is placed just inside the front door. Gilbert Morse was a farm labourer, John Webb a coal miner stroke hewer, Bertie Craddock a baker's assistant, John Griffin a collier was married to Florence with a daughter Hetty, Alex Lawrence was also a coal miner stroke hewer, and Edmund Vimpany worked on the family farm. In World War II, 2 men died, and their plaque is sited in the main hall of the Memorial Hall, Alan Aldridge and Ronald Morse. Not all Whitecroft men fought in World War II. After all, the pits had to remain open. Therefore many joined the Home Guard, and Whitecroft had its own platoon, with the station master Mr. Savage acting as the sergeant, and Ron Hill's dog as a secret weapon. Other men became ARP wardens, and all were much in action in the village one night in the early 1940s. After a sortie over Bristol, a German bomber flew over the village, and on being picked out by the searchlights sighted at Yorkley, released its remaining cargo of 2 bombs. Fortunately, they fell in one of Turnout Farm's fields, causing large craters and covering the nearby cows in mud. Shrapnel was found in Bream and Pillowell, much to the delight of many young boys. Luckily, nobody was seriously hurt, just a few cuts from broken windows. After the all clear sounded, the villagers gathered in the Miners' Arms for a soothing drink. Purely medicinal, you understand. Suddenly the landlord, Mr. Hawkins, realised his son Cyril was absent. He had recently arrived home on a furlough from the army. Everyone rushed upstairs to his room, where he was found still fast asleep. The ceiling had collapsed on top of his bed, and he was lying under a pile of plaster and wood, completely unaware of events. He had a few cuts and bruises, but was otherwise unscathed. The railway played a major role during the conflict, transporting munitions and poison gas into the forest for safekeeping. These trains would skirt the village along the mineral loop line to Moseley Green. It was not an easy trip due to the steep gradient involved. The wagons were heavily loaded and needed 3 engines to pull them. Once they arrived at the junction in Whitecroft, 2 locos would uncouple from the front, run round to the back in order to push the wagons up the incline. On one particular day in 1943, the gas-laden train was halted. 2 locos uncoupled in order to change ends. However, either the brakes failed on the train or were not applied properly, and the wagons started to run back towards Lydney. The engine drivers blared their whistles to warn the signalman at Tufts Junction, who luckily heard the commotion, saw the wagons hurtling towards him, and quickly switched the points and sent the wagons onto a short siding that led into a gully. The wagons ended in a heap in the valley in a cloud of orange dust. Out of the wreckage climbed the guardsman, shouting, "I've been gassed!" His orange face turned bright red when it was realised it was rust, not gas. Nevertheless, the adjacent cottages were evacuated until the wagons were removed. A large crane was brought in by the American Army to lift the precious cargo. It was their gas after all. The signalman was highly commended by the Great Western Railway for his quick actions. VE celebrations were very muted in the village in May 1945, though it would appear some cider was found for a few toasts. The gentleman holding the basket and downing a glass of the amber nectar is apparently the Lord Mayor, Eddie Rook. Candles were put in front windows to commemorate the end of the blackout, but no other event is reported. To finish the story of the village at war, I must mention briefly a happy outcome. Whitecroft had a GI bride. Marjorie Aldridge from the mill worked for the Americans during the war in admin and had met Chuck Agrest of Syracuse and fallen in love. They were married on the 14th of July 1945, and according to the Gloucester Journal, Marjorie wore a dress of heavy white crepe with a train, an embroidered veil and a headdress of camellias. She carried a trailing bouquet of red roses. Amazing what the Americans could get hold of off ration. Marjorie moved to Syracuse and lived happily ever after. She and Chuck had 3 children and many grandchildren. Unfortunately, Chuck died in March 2018 and Marjorie the following year. So there we are, a few stories about Dabdown. If you want to find out more, there are 3 books about the village available on Amazon, eBay, or by contacting jennycare@btinternet.com. Thank you for watching. Many thanks to all those who contributed to the making of this video.